Hello fellow bike people. I gotta start this video by saying I'm kind of disappointed. I had all these things planned out. This bike was supposed to be used for another episode of Project Used Bikes. I was going to go out to Peterborough over Thanksgiving. I was going to donate it to the community bike shop out there. I was going to show you everything they do and what they're about. I was really stoked on it. But all the pandemic numbers have spiked again, the second wave's come, all the restrictions are coming back, so all those plans got cancelled. And I still plan to make that episode later, but for now I'm kind of left with just doing the work on the bike, getting it cleaned up, and there's not much else I can do. So, not going to be a full episode of Project Used Bikes. I'm just going to show you how to overhaul one of these BMX bottom brackets, because these things are always creaky. So these cranks are the type with the pinch bolt on the side there. A lot of BMX bikes that are, they come complete, they're just basic BMX bikes, or even some higher end ones still have this type of crank. These are popular because they're cheap to produce and they're a fairly solid design. They just take a fair amount of maintenance. The other types of BMX cranks where they just press fit into place, those don't really have the same issues with coming loose. So if they do come loose, it's probably because they're just worn out and dead. These, on the other hand, you gotta disassemble, clean out, re-grease pretty often to keep them from getting creaky. The first tools you're gonna need are gonna be to remove the cranks and the rear wheel. You need your ratchet for your rear wheel to loosen off the chain, and you're going to need the appropriate Allen keys for your cranksets. Some of these take an 8mm in there, some of them use a 14mm socket, the vast majority just use a 6mm Allen key. So, by taking off the back wheel, it's loosened off the chain. By just loosening the pinch bolt on the side and removing the compression bolt, you've been able to just pop the crank arm off. Next tools you're going to need is a hammer and something to use as a punch. I'm using an old socket extension, but you can use basically anything. There are proper punch tools for this, but if you're doing it at home you really don't need it, so I'm going to show you the home way. If the crank is stuck in the bottom bracket, you might have to give it a few taps just to get it out. Just be really careful not to mess up the spindle here though, because it can make it hard to get the crank back on. With the crank fully removed, you just put your socket extension or whatever you're using as a punch in there and just bash the bearings out. So having taken all this apart, I just noticed there's no spacer in there, it's just the bearings. I'll be honest, I do that a lot of the time on my own bikes. I don't bother putting the spacer in, but I always do it on customers' bikes because you never want those bearings to implode. I don't think I have an extra spacer, so I'm going to have to set it up like this again. So it might still creak a little bit, but we're going to try and minimize that. So this is a fairly powerful degreaser spray that I like to use at the shop, but for this you can use any kind of, even a household cleaner will work. You just got to get something to get all that grit and grime out of there. And we're going to give the bearings the same treatment. Now this stuff is a bicycle specific grease, but you don't have to use this exactly. Any grease will do. You can even use like that generic Castrol automotive bearing grease. That'll do the trick. Now that I've got the whole bottom bracket bearing assembly cleaned, re-greased, and reassembled, it's time to do the same thing to the crank itself. So, a little head of that, we give it all a nice wipe. I'm going to put a little bit of grease inside there, but just the littlest bit. Because too much grease in here is going to pick up dirt and cause all kinds of nastiness later. And you want to do the other side as well. When you're disassembling this, you want to take all the spacers, lay them out in the exact order that they came off the bike. That way it's easy to reassemble later. Once you've done both sides, slide it all back together and put everything back together in the same order as before. Yeah, so now that's all back together. Something to keep an eye on when you're reassembling this is that the top hat spacer slides nicely into the sprocket if it's that tight. You'd be amazed how often I see that offset, and that causes the whole sprocket to have a big hot spot and a hopping, and it makes the bike near unpedalable. Something else to think about is the pinch bolts here. those need to be a fair bit tighter than you would normally think. They're the bit that comes loose first on this type of cranks. You can really reef on those. For reassembling the back wheels, getting these bolts tightened down is another really important thing, just like the pinch bolts here. You can reef on those, and you got to make sure that you put your whole body weight into it so you don't have the wheel slipping later. In terms of chain tension, lots of riders have different styles for this. Unless you're riding a free coaster, which needs a little bit more chain slack, I like to find the tightest spot in the crank rotation, make sure the chain's nice and snug there with a few millimeters of up and down movement, but no actual slack. And this is the last thing to make sure your drivetrain's running nice and quiet, it's chain lube. I really like this stuff from Finish Line, it's their ceramic wet lube, but you can use basically anything. I mean, in a pinch you can use motor oil, but again, like putting too much grease here, that's going to make a huge mess. You want a good bike-specific chain lube, but it doesn't matter exactly which one you use. That should do the trick. Now this bike should be nice and silent. I'm going to go test it to make sure I didn't just waste my whole time making this video.
Man, I'm out of practice. Ever since the spring, there's just been too much working, not enough riding happening. But this repair was a great success. It's buttery smooth and totally silent now. I just did a quick rip around the block, nothing fancy, but man, this bike feels really good. Only other big change I made is I added a brake to it, because the last owner cut the brake mounts off the back, and I can't in good conscience donate a brakeless bike. So, let's put this on here for safety reasons. Other than that, put this bike in my closet and it's all ready to donate, and yeah, keep an eye out for that video.